The blood trail led straight to his water well. Tobias Hartwell, seasoned by 37 years on the harsh, unforgiving ranch, recognized the distinct pattern. Not the splatter of a deer, but the desperate, telltale drips of something far more significant. Rounding the corner of his barn, the grim reality seized him, halting his hand mid-reach for his rifle. A young indigenous warrior lay huddled against the cool stone of the well, one hand clutched against a grievous wound in his side, the other reaching with waning strength toward the beckoning wooden bucket, a mere 3 feet distant. Each breath was a ragged, painful gasp, and though shadowed by pain, the dark eyes tracked Tobias's every move, alert and wary as if expecting death to spring from any quarter. This was 1847, an era where encountering an indigenous man on your land signified a single chilling prospect: devastation, a calamity culminating in a bloodied scalp or burning homesteads. Every soul residing within 50 miles would prescribe the same brutal solution: a swift bullet to the savage's skull, burying him in an unmarked grave where no soul could exhume the deed. Tobias raised his rifle, his finger poised upon the precipice of the trigger. The pragmatic resolution, the safeguarded approach, the anticipated conclusion. Yet something within those imploring dark eyes gave him pause. It transcended mere agony. He saw the very embodiment of the parched desperation he'd felt during the drought of '44. The agonizing 3 days when water became a phantom and death felt like a tangible certainty. It was a fundamental human need, eclipsing skin tone, linguistic divides, or allegiances forged in the fires of conflict. The indigenous man attempted speech, his parched lips cracked and bleeding, but only a whisper escaped. Water. Tobias lowered his rifle and reached for the bucket. His neighbors would brand him a simpleton. His brother back east would deem him consumed by frontier madness. Perhaps they would be correct. Yet as he knelt beside the wounded stranger, gently pressing the weathered wooden rim to those desperate lips, watching him drink with the fervor of a man snatched from the jaws of drowning, Tobias comprehended one irrevocable truth: their lives were about to irrevocably change. Unbeknownst to Tobias, this injured warrior was far from a mere member of the local tribes. The unfolding events would summon more riders to his humble ranch than he had witnessed throughout his entire lifetime. The indigenous man imbibed with a fervor echoing days of deprivation, consuming 3 entire buckets before his trembling hands could maintain a steady grip on the rim. Tobias observed each gulp, his mind racing with the ramifications of his actions. In this treacherous territory, demonstrating compassion toward an indigenous person amounted to signing one's own death warrant. However, as vitality slowly returned to the warrior's countenance, Tobias discerned a detail that sent a chilling wave through his veins. The wound marring the man's side was not the consequence of an animal attack or a hunting mishap. It was a bullet wound, acutely fresh, still emanating blood, and judging from the angle and the telltale powder burns, inflicted at close quarters, immediate close quarters. This meant that the perpetrator could be in pursuit, tracking the identical scarlet path that culminated at Tobias's ranch. They might be descending upon his property at that very moment, guns primed, seeking answers Tobias could not furnish. The indigenous man seemed to sense his rising apprehension. Summoning immense effort, he raised a hand, gesturing toward the horizon, then mimed a cutting motion across his throat. The meaning was unequivocally clear. Imminent peril loomed. Tobias's heart pounded against his ribs. Every instinct screamed for him to conceal this wounded stranger, obliterate the evidence, feign ignorance. But the man could scarcely sit upright, let alone attempt to walk. Any attempt to relocate him would likely prove fatal, and leaving him exposed amounted to adorning them both with targets. That's when Tobias discerned it, the sound that had secured his survival through 12 grueling years of frontier life, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses riding with haste converging directly upon his ranch. The indigenous man heard them as well. A flicker of genuine terror sparked in his eyes, and he pressed himself against the well, as if minimizing his profile could render him invisible. Fresh blood seeped through his fingers, pressed against his wound. Tobias seized the empty bucket, frantically dousing the blood trail. Time was a luxury they could ill afford. The riders would be upon them within minutes, if not seconds. He gazed at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his life, turning it on its head in a single afternoon. A man whose mere presence endangered them both, yet whose dark eyes held a quality Tobias had never encountered in an indigenous man: gratitude. Raw, untainted human gratitude. The hoofbeats grew louder, distinct enough to enumerate. 5 horses, perhaps 6, all at a gallop that bespoke malicious intent. Tobias made his decision in that fleeting instant, cognizant that it could very well be his last. He was incapable of carrying the wounded man, but he could conceal him. The weathered root cellar behind the barn, if they could even make it that far. But as he extended his hand to assist the indigenous man to his feet, the warrior seized his wrist with unexpected strength and slowly shook his head. Then he performed an act that sent shivers crawling across Tobias's skin. He smiled, not the thankful smile of a rescued man, but the knowing smile of someone acutely aware of who was cresting the hill. The riders crested the ridge like a tempestuous storm front. 6 men astride thundering horses, dust billowing behind them, rifles gleaming in the waning sunlight. Tobias recognized the lead rider immediately. Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose reputation for ruthless violence preceded him into every settlement from the Pecos to Santa Fe. Webb embodied the lawman who discharged his weapon first, dispensing questions later, especially concerning indigenous affairs. A man who amassed scalps as trophies and christened it justice. A man who would incinerate a ranch and its inhabitants on mere suspicion of harboring fugitives. Tobias planted himself before the well, physically obstructing the indigenous man from view, striving to project an air of nonchalance, as if his sole concern was repairing a dilapidated fence post. His mouth felt parched as the desert floor. Webb reined his horse a mere 10 feet distant, close enough for Tobias to discern the calculated coldness in his pale blue eyes. The remaining 5 men dispersed, forming a semicircle, their hands resting conspicuously upon their weapons. This was no amicable visit. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb drawled, his voice possessing the languid cadence of a man who knew he wielded absolute power. "We're tracking a wounded indigenous man. The blood trail terminates right here on your property." Tobias felt beads of perspiration forming on his brow despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any indigenous folks, Marshal. Been mending the south fence all day." Webb's gaze swept across the ranch, assimilating every minute detail. The man missed nothing. It was precisely that vigilance that rendered him so perilous. His eyes lingered upon the dark stains marring the soil near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach plunge. Is that so? Because that undeniably appears to be blood. Fresh blood. And unless you've taken to butchering livestock next to your drinking water, I'd surmise someone has been here recently. Concealed behind the well's stone facade, the wounded indigenous man remained perfectly still, but Tobias could sense the palpable tension emanating from him like heat radiating from a blacksmith's forge. A single sound, a solitary movement, would spell their demise. Webb advanced 3 paces, his hand now openly resting upon the butt of his pistol. "You are aware of the consequences of harboring indigenous fugitives, aren't you, Hartwell? The same penalty as treason, a rope to the neck until dead." The words hung suspended in the air like a death knell. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coil, primed to fight or flee, fully aware that neither avenue guaranteed salvation. Webb stood too close. Any abrupt gesture would expose the indigenous man, and the subsequent barrage of bullets would commence without hesitation. Then, an unexpected event transpired. The wounded indigenous man spoke, not in English, but in his native tongue, a series of words that resonated with clarity and power, a stark contrast to his compromised physical state. Words that induced Marshal Webb to freeze in place, his face draining of color as rapidly as water cascading from a breached dam. Webb's hand recoiled from his pistol. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for oxygen, and when his voice finally returned, it was reduced to a mere whisper. "Dear God, it's you." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons momentarily forgotten, their faces reflecting a mixture of stunned disbelief and a glimmer of something akin to fear. but not the primal fear of confronting a formidable adversary, but the chilling fear born of realizing one has committed a profound error. Webb pivoted towards Tobias, his face now ashen as a winter snowfall. "Do you have any semblance of who you have been aiding?" Tobias stared into Marshal Webb's terrified visage, his mind reeling. In 12 years of enduring frontier life, he had never witnessed the merciless lawmen betray fear of any kind, not outlaws, not savage beasts, not even the Apache war parties who had reduced 3 settlements to charred embers the previous summer. But now, Webb resembled a man who had just beheld a spectral apparition. The wounded indigenous man spoke once more, this time in impeccable English, his voice imbued with an authority that seemed to permeate the entire ranch. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so relentlessly to find me." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he swallowed hard. When he eventually spoke, his voice cracked like a youth experiencing puberty. "This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt the ground beneath him give way. The peace treaty, the very same treaty that had terminated 3 years of barbaric conflict between the settlers and the Apache. The very treaty that had safeguarded countless lives on both sides. The very treaty that had permitted families to establish themselves in this territory without living under the constant duress of impending raids. And he had just been providing water to the architect of that very peace. But if Ayanna was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing from the law with a bullet lodged in his side? "There was an ambush," Ayanna continued, his breathing labored, yet his voice gathering strength with each enunciation. 3 days prior, a meeting with Colonel Morrison regarding extending the treaty to include the southern territories. But Morrison had other agendas. Webb's face deepened from pale to ashen. "Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back during an indigenous attack 3 days ago. You are wanted for his murder." "Because that is what they desire you to believe," Ayanna asserted, straightening himself against the well. "Morrison was not slain by indigenous hands. He was murdered by men garbed in war paint, uttering rudimentary Apache to deceive witnesses, men who possessed intimate knowledge of when and where we would convene." The ramifications struck Tobias with the force of a physical blow. Someone had orchestrated Morrison's murder to frame Ayanna, someone with the explicit intention of destroying the peace treaty, someone who sought to reignite the fires of conflict throughout the territory. "Who?" Webb queried, his expression betraying his suspicions. Ayanna's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The very individuals who have been peddling weapons to the renegade tribes, the very individuals who have been accumulating fortunes from this war, the very individuals who dispatched you to hunt me down instead of seeking the authentic perpetrators." Webb recoiled, his hand moving instinctively towards his weapon before arresting the motion. "You are speaking of treason, of corruption penetrating the territorial government. These are grave allegations. And they will remain allegations until I can substantiate them," Ayanna retorted. "Which is precisely why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they discharged a bullet into me and left me to perish. Why they are relying on men such as yourself to complete the endeavor." Tobias observed this exchange with growing unease. He had initially believed he was assisting a wounded stranger. Instead, he had stumbled into the vortex of a conspiracy poised to shatter the territory. Yet what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayanna spoke the truth, Marshal Webb had not arrived to apprehend a fugitive, but to commit cold-blooded murder. Silence stretched, taut as a rope on the verge of snapping. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands hovering near their weapons, their gazes darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache who had just accused half of the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could witness the internal war raging behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped between the mandates of duty and the dictates of truth, between adhering to directives and succumbing to the demands of his conscience, and men like Webb were ill-equipped to navigate moral quandaries. They typically resolved them with bullets. "Even if what you are asserting holds merit," Webb began, his voice laced with reluctance, "I am bound by my orders. You are wanted for Morrison's murder. My mandate is to deliver you, dead or alive. Dead would certainly be more convenient." Ayanna responded, his voice unwavering despite the pain etched across his face. Deceased men cannot testify. Deceased men cannot reveal who genuinely benefits from the perpetuation of indigenous conflict. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with apprehensive eyes, leaned forward. "Marshal, if he is telling the truth regarding the peace treaty—" "Silence, Bradley," Webb snapped. But Tobias could discern the creeping tendrils of doubt infiltrating the marshal's resolve like cracks spider-webbing across a dam. That was when Ayanna played his final card. Summoning strength from reserves unknown, he reached into a leather pouch secured at his belt and withdrew a folded piece of parchment stained with blood. This is why they sought to eliminate me. A letter penned by Colonel Morrison the night before his demise. Webb regarded the letter as if it might spontaneously combust. What does it contain? It exposes the identities of those supplying weaponry to the renegade tribes, names, dates, amounts, sufficient evidence to condemn a dozen men. Ayanna's eyes remained fixed upon Webb's countenance, including evidence that someone within the territorial marshal's office has been accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. The words impacted Webb with the force of a physical assault. His face transitioned through a spectrum of pallor before settling upon a sickly green hue. Behind him, his men exchanged furtive glances, exhibiting newfound interest in the grooming of their horses' manes. Tobias's heart hammered in his chest. He was witnessing an event that could result in their collective demise. The precise moment when a corrupt lawman realized his own neck was poised beneath the executioner's blade. "You are fabricating," Webb challenged, his voice devoid of conviction. "Am I?" Ayanna held up the letter. "Morrison entrusted me with this on the eve of his death, instructing me to deliver it to Fort Richardson should anything befall him, claiming it was insurance." Webb advanced, his hand now gripping his pistol. "Hand over that letter." "So you can obliterate it?" Ayanna shook his head. "I think not, Marshal, but I will extend an offer. Allow me to live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I will ensure your name remains unmentioned when this all surfaces." The proposition hung suspended in the air like gun smoke. Tobias could see Webb calculating, evaluating risks, striving to determine which decision would prolong his survival. Yet the events that unfolded next confounded everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and approached the well, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Marshal, something has been weighing on me. Recall that shipment of rifles that vanished 3 months ago, the one we were informed had been pilfered by indigenous raiders?" Webb's face clouded with anger. "What of it? I witnessed those very rifles 2 weeks later in the possession of settlers heading south." Bradley's youthful face flushed with courage or perhaps trepidation. It made me wonder who was truly stealing from whom. The admission served as a catalyst. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, exchanging knowing glances, recalling events that had seemed insignificant at the time. Tobias comprehended that Ayanna had accomplished something remarkable. Without firing a shot or raising his voice, he had turned Webb's own men against him. "You are all fools," Webb snarled, his facade of civility crumbling. "You believe this savage's word carries weight against mine? You believe anyone will credit the testimony of a deceased indigenous person and a handful of traitors?" The deputies instinctively spread out, their hands edging towards their weapons. Yet Tobias could discern the uncertainty etched upon their faces. Years of adhering to orders battled against the growing recognition that those orders might be fundamentally flawed. Ayanna struggled to his feet, utilizing the stone well for support. Blood seeped through his fingers, pressed against his wound, yet his voice remained firm. "Truth remains indifferent to its messenger, Marshal. It simply exists." Webb spat. "The truth is that you murdered an officer of the United States Army, and I intend to collect the bounty placed upon your head." He drew his pistol in one fluid motion, the barrel aimed towards Ayanna, but before he could discharge it, Deputy Bradley interposed himself, his own weapon raised. "Stand down, Marshal!" The command reverberated across the ranch like thunder. 4 other deputies mirrored Bradley's actions, training their weapons upon their commanding officer. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who appeared as tainted as his superior. "You are courting disaster, boys," Webb warned, perspiration beading upon his brow. A disaster that will strip you of your badges, perhaps even your lives. Possibly, Bradley conceded, but I have made a surfeit of mistakes adhering to your directives. No more. Tobias observed this standoff with rising dread. 6 armed men on his property, all brandishing weapons at one another, all convinced of the righteousness of their cause. This was the genesis of range wars. This was how honorable men perished for ignoble reasons. Then, Ayana performed an unexpected act. He commenced singing, not in English, but in Apache, a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the very earth. The ancient words carried across the ranch, like wind whistling through canyon walls, articulating themes of honor, sacrifice, of brotherhood forged against the encroaching darkness. The effect was immediate and profound. The deputies incrementally lowered their weapons, not comprehending the lyrics, but sensing their power. Even Webb appeared momentarily entranced by the sound, and while they listened, captivated, Ayana was engaged in another endeavor. He was calling to his people. The song served as a signal, a message carried upon the evening breeze to ears trained to listen. Tobias recognized this with a jolt that ran down his spine like glacial water. Ayana was not merely singing, he was summoning reinforcements. The melody concluded, and silence settled upon the ranch like a suffocating shroud. But within that silence, Tobias discerned a sound that chilled him to the core. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats, distant yet growing louder. The sound of a multitude moving swiftly. Webb heard them too, his face transformed to a ghostly white. How many? Ayana smiled despite his agony. Sufficient. The sound intensified, multiplying until it resembled thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was converging upon Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within mere minutes. Webb raised his pistol once more, this time aiming it directly at Tobias's chest. You orchestrated this. You assisted him in signaling them. I provided water to a dying man, Tobias responded, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. As I would for any creature suffering upon my land. The hoofbeats were close enough to feel in the earth beneath their feet, close enough to deem countless, and Webb finally comprehended Ayana's grand strategy. They emerged over the horizon like an apparition from another realm. 50 Apache warriors astride thundering horses, moving in seamless formation, their war paint gleaming in the fading sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias registered something that defied everything he had been taught about indigenous war parties. They were not there to engage in battle. At the forefront rode an elderly chief whose mere presence commanded respect from hundreds of yards away. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his advanced age, he sat upon his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed before any mortal. Trailing behind him were warriors of all ages, from seasoned veterans to young braves barely old enough to wield weapons. Yet their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through bewilderment, fear, and frantic calculation. He still clutched his pistol, aimed at Tobias, but his hand trembled as if gripped by a fever. This changes nothing. I am still bound by my orders. Your orders, a new voice interjected, are no longer operative. Everyone turned to observe Deputy Bradley brandishing an official document. This communication arrived this morning, Marshal, dispatched directly from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayana is suspended, pending an investigation into the murder of Colonel Morrison. Webb's face flushed crimson with rage. You lying piece of... Consult your own dispatch pouch, Bradley interrupted, unless you have been too occupied with collecting bounties to peruse your official correspondence. The Apache riders formed a vast circle around the ranch, exhibiting no overt threat, yet their presence was undeniable. Their chief dismounted and approached the well where his son awaited. With each step, the old man's eyes remained locked upon Ayana's face, seeking indicators of grievous injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh emanated from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing a sacred reunion, a leader reunited with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he had sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands examining the wound, his face etched with concern. Ayanna responded in kind, but Tobias recognized interspersed English phrases, sufficient to glean the general context, the truth, the conspiracy, the identities of the genuine perpetrators. When the discourse concluded, the chief turned to confront Webb, his eyes like obsidian. When he spoke, his English was flawless and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son informs me that you arrived with the intention of murdering him." Webb's pistol wavered. "I came to apprehend a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief retorted. "A man whose sole transgression was uncovering how you and your cohorts have been profiteering from conflict between our peoples." The accusation lingered in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's remaining ally, Hawkins, slowly maneuvered his horse away from the circle, calculating his odds of escape. "You possess no substantiation," Webb claimed, his voice cracking on the utterance. The chief smiled, not with warmth, but with the self-assuredness of a man holding all the trumps. "We possess Morrison's letter. We possess the testimony of the actual murderers, those who confessed everything prior to their demise during an attempt to evade our justice. And we have something more." He gestured to one of his warriors who advanced carrying a leather satchel. From its depths, the warrior produced a stack of documents that caused Webb's face to pale to the color of ash. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every falsehood you disseminated to conceal your activities. Morrison was more meticulous than you knew." Webb's world collapsed in that instant. Tobias watched as a corrupt man realized that all his machinations, all his acts of violence, all his betrayals had amounted to nothing. The evidence was irrefutable, the witnesses reliable, justice unavoidable. But cornered animals could be unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol towards the chief, desperation eclipsing reason. "If I am descending, I am taking you with me." The ensuing events transpired with blinding speed. Ayanna hurled himself between the gun and his father, despite his agonizing wound. The pistol discharged and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons, but the shot veered wide. Tobias Hartwell, a humble rancher who had merely sought to assist a parched man, had tackled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them crashing into the dirt. Dust settled, like a curtain descending upon the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol cast aside. Deputy Bradley and his men swiftly secured both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. The chief approached Tobias, who was sitting on the ground catching his breath. The old man's weathered face revealed no emotion as he studied the white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache, words that carried the weight of ceremony. Ayanna translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "You are now brother to our people, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear. These are the actions of a true warrior." Tobias felt something shift in his chest. He had been taught that indigenous people were savages, enemies. Looking into the chief's eyes, he saw wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned. The Apache formed a circle around him. Each touched his hand in kinship. The chief gave Tobias a gift, a war lance decorated with eagle feathers. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained. "It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache until today." As the sun set, the Apache prepared to leave. Ayanna clasped Tobias's hand. "You saved more than my life. You saved the peace." "I just gave a thirsty man some water," Tobias replied. "Sometimes," Ayanna smiled, "that's how the world changes, one cup of water at a time." Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted. The gun-running operation was dismantled and the peace treaty was expanded. Tobias Hartwell became the first white man adopted into the Apache Nation. In the Old West, the greatest battles were won with the courage to see enemies as human and to choose compassion over fear. So, there you have it, a story of how a simple act of kindness, a single cup of water offered to a wounded stranger, could ripple outwards to change the course of history. It reminds us that even in the most divided times, our shared humanity can bridge the deepest divides and that courage often lies not in violence, but in compassion. It really begs the question, what small act of kindness can you offer today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you most in this story? What did you think of Tobias's decision? Do you have any questions or reflections you'd like to share? Please leave a comment down below. Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of courage, compassion, and unexpected connections from history, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos.